Welcome back. The crisis of hijacked buildings in Johannesburg remains a focal point of national debate, particularly following the high-profile killing of media personality Warrick, also known as DJ Warras, on Tuesday outside a contested building in the CBD. His death has catalyzed a renewed, often heated conversation about the lawlessness of vertical informal settlements and the state's role in reclaiming them. Let's chat more about this with Chad Thomas from IRS Forensic Investigations. Chad, a very good evening to you. In the spotlight, as it should be, I think, 365. But now, of course, because of the killing of DJ Warras, hijacked buildings. Chad, just talk to us about the business of abandoned and hijacked buildings and how big it is.
Hi, Masa, and good evening to the viewers, and thank you for the invitation. Hijacked buildings have become an increasing phenomenon in South Africa, primarily in inner cities that are suffering some or other dereliction. When one looks to Johannesburg, in particular the CBD, and in the surrounding areas, Hillbrow, Joburg Park, Berea, Yeoville, hijacking of buildings has become big business. It's become big business from the mid to late 90s, and it's on the increase. Surprisingly, when researching the subject, there's even a Wikipedia page dedicated specifically to the phenomena of hijacked buildings in South Africa, talking specifically to Johannesburg and Durban, stating that there's about 200 hijacked major buildings, in other words, apartment blocks or office blocks, and 250 private residences. I think the figure on the private residences has increased phenomenally since that report came out in 2023. But if we look at the business of hijacked buildings, it's become a massive problem. When we go back to the mid to late 90s, it was buildings that were abandoned by landlords that were unable to cope with the changes in the inner cities. A lot of these buildings were taken over at that stage by immigrants and drug dealers. They were turned into drug dens. They were turned into areas where there was a lot of prostitution. And then local syndicates cottoned on to the fact that these could become very valuable in terms of real estate. And like you mentioned in the introduction to the insert, these are vertical informal settlements. You now have apartments, two-bedroom apartments that are housing 20, 30, upwards of 40 people in some cases. And this is huge money. We've heard that some buildings can generate up to 4 to 5 million rand a month because of the sheer volume of people they're squeezing into these buildings.
You know, a lot of the time, especially while you go out into the field and report and go into some of these buildings as well, a lot of people will say a majority of the people in those buildings are people who are just looking for housing. But the living conditions are also quite hazardous to their own, it's not in their own best interest for them to be staying in buildings that are dilapidated either. But when it comes to arresting this problem, Chad, why isn't the government or the state able to handle this? Because we've moved past the point of nipping it in the bud. It's mushroomed now. How does it actually work once a building is being hijacked? Is it left forsaken from the 90s, like you're mentioning, some of those buildings? And then, you know, you kind of wash your hands and there's nothing else you can do because now you need to find alternative accommodation.
You mentioned a couple of interesting points. The first being that these buildings are hazardous. They're beyond hazardous. You must understand that water and electricity have been cut off to these buildings. They're illegally connected to adjoining buildings, or they've illegally connected to other supplies. The buildings themselves haven't been serviced or maintained. Lift shafts are empty. Stairwells are collapsing. Parking lots are collapsing. Sewerage is floating. We went into a building in 2015, the Monies building across from F&B Bank City in downtown Johannesburg, with Angelique Sorrell, who was the investigations manager at the start at the time. And that building had been hijacked. And while we were going through this building, we actually stumbled across a body, somebody that had been murdered in that building. And there was gang markings throughout the building. This was 10 years ago. We've known about this problem for a very long time, and this is once again what I call the Band-Aid approach. Now that somebody exceptionally high profile has been killed and it's linked back purportedly to a hijacked building, now suddenly the authorities are raiding these buildings and acting as if they're now going to take action. But this is a problem that dates back 30 years to the mid-1990s. It's a problem that we've known is there. And like you said, what do you do with these people? Where do you take them? What arrangements need to be made? Because this problem is ever developing. And the scary part is when local syndicates took over, we started seeing the involvement of police officers. Police officers were named, police officers were charged both from Hillbrow and Johannesburg Central, and we saw that there was protection given to these syndicates by corrupt police officers. We're now also seeing bad actors within the security industry infiltrating these syndicates, and instead of disrupting and dismantling these syndicates, they're offering these syndicates protection. So it's in a disastrous position in terms of how to address this particular issue without it just being a band-aid approach and looking at the long-term measures that are going to perhaps solve this problem.
And as you're mentioning, we've known about this for a very long time. And also, if you go into some of these areas as well, the locals will quickly point out to you, and you can also see from the outside the buildings that have been hijacked. So it seems like a low-hanging fruit. Why not then, you've mentioned this police involvement as well, but does it not escalate all the way to national when we know that, like, there are officers who are involved in certain police stations as well? Because surely we know which buildings to go for to ensure that there's law enforcement that takes place there, but that's not happening.
We do know which buildings there are. If you look at Hillbrow, for example, there's a security company on the ground there that's been in place for many, many, many years. It's a company that has taken control of certain abandoned buildings on instruction of owners, and they've been able to, in some instances, even rehabilitate these buildings, bring in legitimate tenants who are vetted, and to be able to maintain these buildings to a proper standard and pay what's owed to the city of Johannesburg. But in other instances, you see organizations getting involved that have nefarious agendas. The biggest problem we have is, where do we put these people? We're talking about tens of thousands of people that are living illegally and have nowhere else to go. Some of them are undocumented immigrants. Some of them are South Africans from rural areas. They've all come to, if we're talking about Johannesburg, to the City of Gold in the hope of finding a better life for their families back home as well as for themselves in the city. Where do we take them? A lot of people are granted refugee asylum status in South Africa, but you can't show me one refugee camp in South Africa. You get that refugee asylum document and you're left on your own. You come from rural South Africa looking for a job with your SASSA grant, but there's nowhere for you to go. What happens once you clear these buildings? Because we only see action taken when a building burns down, when somebody is murdered or raped in a building, or in this instance where somebody high profile is killed. There is no long-term plan in place from either local, provincial or national government as to what to do with these people that will become displaced once they're removed from these buildings.
You know, a little earlier I mentioned the mushrooming of this problem as well. We do also tend to focus on the Joburg CBD, but this is also a problem in the Durban CBD and Gqeberha as well, in Cape Town and in the other parts of the country. But we're also seeing it kind of infiltrate into suburban areas, residential areas as well. In recent weeks, we saw that raid at a property in Bryanston by the MMC of Public Safety in Johannesburg. And there, Chad, we found, you know, hundreds of people living on this property, and there were informal settlements that were built there too. So would you say that it's infiltrating beyond the city centers as well and now going into residential areas? And what are the risks of that?
Most definitely it's spreading. The case you're speaking about in Bryanston, that actually erected timber huts throughout the premises, they'd emptied the swimming pool, and that of course invaded the house itself. That house, the owner claimed that they'd gone overseas on holiday. When they came back, they found that it had been invaded, and that was back in 2020 during COVID. Now suddenly 5 years later, we see a raid taking place. My offices are in Houghton, and I can tell you that there are many abandoned houses in Houghton, whether they're deliberately abandoned by somebody who wants to develop them and wants those buildings condemned so that they can build on that land and hope that there's an invasion that can later get an eviction notice and bring in the red ants. I don't know. But it's one of the theories that's been given in respect of how it's mushroomed out into areas like Houghton, like Sandton, like Bryanston. We're talking upmarket areas where these invasions are taking place. But the problem lies within the fact that neighbors would have known about this, neighbors would have reported this, but the departments responsible didn't react in time. And now what do you do with these displaced people?
Yeah. Chad, as I let you go, just to let you know as well, and our viewers, that there is actually an inspection that's going on now, this evening, from this hour at 7 o'clock, by the city of Joburg in Bryanston once again, because there is, it seems, more hijacked buildings there. But Chad, really appreciate your time as usual and your insights.